Now let's talk about the state and discourses on development in post-colonial society. So development is defined as a qualitative change in a country's mode of production, so the total economic system, technology, resources, and industries, and in a country's relations of production, so the social and power structures governing how people work and produce goods for survival. And so policy making is a form of social experimentation. There's no single truth or solution. The view of underdeveloped Africa ignores the continent's vast economic variations. It's rooted in prejudice, blaming intrinsic African features like geography or corruption, rather than historical and structural factors like its place in the global economy. Now we take a look at the developmental state as an alternative model. Now, this model is a state-led, market-driven alternative to the laissez-faire history of Europe, exemplified by Asian states. The core idea is that the state can discipline private capital using both incentives and penalties to align private profit with national development goals. And so industrial policy is dynamic and strategic state assistance to boost specific economic activities to address not just economic catch-up, but also modern challenges like climate change and national security. But then what are the key features of a developmental state? Well, we have developmental institutions. There's the importance of pilot agencies, state-controlled finance, and SOEs. And the key state functions, according to Alice Amsden, include development banking, local content management, selective seclusion, opening some markets and protecting others, and national firm rotation. But then what is developmentalism? Well, the state makes manufacturing profitable for private firms by offering subsidies and monopoly rights. But this is on condition that these monopoly profits are redistributed for the benefit of the broader population. But then what are some lessons for a potential South African developmental state? Well, for industrial policy to succeed, the state must identify strategic sectors for structural change, allocate subsidies and resources to socialize risk for firms, monitor firm performance to prevent elite capture, and provide crucial public goods like education, R&D, and infrastructure that crowd in private investment. But now let's take a look at tariffs as a general development tool. While tariffs protect local infant industries from foreign competition, allowing them to grow, this creates monopolistic rents for local manufacturers, a cost the state accepts in exchange for anticipated benefits like job creation and strategic sovereignty. And this would be ISI, import substitution industrialization. And we also have regional blocks. Nations form customs unions, for example the South African Customs Union, SACU, with a common external tariff to create larger common markets. In South Africa, tariffs were used as a racialized tool. Later, white minority governments used tariff policy explicitly to create employment for the white population, entrenching racial economic disparities. Early tariff policy was careful not to raise costs for the dominant, capital-intensive mining and agricultural export sectors. Now, in terms of tariff setting in South Africa's developmental state during the interwar period, the period between 1920 and 1939 was foundational for South Africa's industrial society. A systematic review of tariff setting was a key driver. The state used a sophisticated system, and the policy was highly effective, creating many jobs. They had suspended duties, so taxes on staples like sugar and milk. They had rebates, so refunding duties on imported intermediate goods if they were used to manufacture goods for export, thus encouraging industrial production. There were anti-dumping duties levied on goods sold below the cost price by foreign producers, which is common in capital-intensive industries with overproduction. And there was also reciprocity. Tariff agreements were linked to conditions on price, market structure, preventing monopolies, and labor market practices, addressing bad labor conditions. Now, mainstream economics argues tariffs raise prices and harm consumer welfare. In contrast, developmental policy argues the goal is to raise the value added in targeted industries above what would be possible under free trade, justifying the short-term costs for the long-term strategic gains. South Africa's tariff-setting process operated within the framework of imperial preference, a system favoring trade within the British Empire, featuring minimum, intermediate, and maximum tariff levels. Imports of consumer and industrial goods from the US and Germany still increase. The major economies are now aggressively using state intervention to secure strategic advantages, like the US Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy and the CHIPS Act for semiconductors. But now, what are the principles of the new industrial policy? Well, first is combining incentives with discipline. Financial support must be coupled with market discipline and local ownership of supply chains. There should also be place-based clusters. Policy should focus on building industrial clusters around leading firms, for example, Samsung or Tesla, and creating low-carbon industrial hubs. And finally, there should be big push investment. Development requires a minimum quantum of investment in social overhead capital, like infrastructure, and several complementary industries at once to create economies of scale. Pricing and access to this infrastructure are critical. The critical failure of South African policy is that the state actively encourages export of raw materials over local beneficiation. Now we move on to labor, gender, and capital accumulation in Africa. First, let's take a look at the work process and accumulation of capital. So capital is composed of constant capital, C, so machinery or raw materials, and variable capital, V, like labor. And then the organic composition of capital is the ratio between them. The workday is divided into necessary labor time to reproduce the worker's subsistence and surplus labor time, the source of profit for capital. Capital accumulation requires expanding surplus value. This is achieved by lengthening the workday or increasing productivity through machinery, so increasing constant capital. And this creates a distributional conflict over surplus. Now, in terms of the South African context, the discovery of minerals, especially gold, created an intense demand for a large, cheap labor force. This required the destruction of pre-capitalist modes of production to force people into wage labor. The development of capitalism posed challenges not only of wage control, but also of social control, so managing the conditions for the production and reproduction of labor power. But now let's take a look at the role of the state in capitalist arguments. So the South African state actively used its power to solve labor supply constraints for mining and agriculture through both enabling laws, like creating SOEs, and coercive laws. Capitalists like the Chamber of Mines justified low wages with the racist backward-bending supply curve theory. The theory falsely claimed that higher wages would lead to less work, and this is as African workers only sought to meet basic tax obligations and would then return to subsistence farming. And this was debunked by Governor Mbeki. The state also created the Native Urban Areas Act and the Native Trust and Land Act. But now let's talk about the critical role of rural homelands and social reproduction. So the system relied on homelands or rural areas to subsidize the cost of labor. The migrant labor system created a link between urban workers and rural peasants. Migrant workers didn't entirely rely on their meager wages for social reproduction. Their families in the rural areas practicing subsistence agriculture bore a significant part of this cost. This allowed capital to pay wages below the level needed to sustain a worker and their family full-time in the city. Workers maintained usufruct rights, so rights to use land but not to own it in the countryside, to which they'd return. This system was crucial for the profitability of South African capital. But now let's take a look at the contrasting models of social reproduction in South Africa versus Zambia. In South Africa, capital and the state externalized the cost of social reproduction by localizing it in rural homelands through the migrant labor system. Within in Zambia, copper mining firms internalized social reproduction by allowing workers' families to live in company compounds from the industry's early days. It was a strategy to reduce production costs and increase stability. Women's unpaid labor in the compound, so cooking, cleaning, and childcare, was central to increasing mine productivity. This labor was exploited under the control of the company and reinforced by patriarchal norms. But now let's see what Nancy Fraser says on social reproduction. So Fraser establishes social reproductive work, so child rearing, housework, and care, as the indispensable background condition for capitalist economic production. It creates and replenishes the workforce. But now let's take a look at the historical shifts and how capitalism organizes this work. So in terms of early industrialism, women and children worked in factories. And then we had the family wage or welfare state era. The state and corporations provided some support, creating a separation between economic, male, and social reproductive, female spheres. Then we move to the financialized capitalism era, the current era. This is a dualized system. The well-off pay for commodified care, so nannies and daycare, while the poor are forced to privatize the care deficit within their families. And this leads to a scramble. This scramble creates global care chains where women from poorer countries, for example the Philippines or Lesotho, migrate to provide care in richer countries, transferring their own care responsibilities onto even poorer women back home. If we take a look at the integrated reality of social reproduction in Marikana, the boundary between work and community life is blurred. Mine work completely drives and organizes social life. The concerns of production, injuries, missed targets, and exhaustion directly become household and community concerns. Women's unpaid work is simultaneously a subsidy to capital because it lowers the cost of reproducing labor power and is a form of social protection. It sustains workers and their communities, especially during crises like strikes. Now we move on to finance, the economy, and development. So, finance and financial markets are meant to do the following. They should price resources and allocate capital to its most productive uses, act as intermediaries between savers and borrowers, reducing risk and volatility to improve economic growth, provide firms in the real economy with access to the needed capital for expansion, and overcome information asymmetries and transaction costs, insulating firms from production disruptions. And so the study of finance is important to understand the historical role of reinvested profits in funding industrialization, understanding how corporations behave after capital market liberalization, understanding the shift towards market-centered financial systems, the changing structures of capitalist accumulation, and the concept of finance capital as the unification of industrial, commercial, and banking capital under the direction of high finance. But now, what is financialization? Well, this is a change in capitalist accumulation where the financial sector captures and distributes a greater share of the economic surplus. The key features include the expansion of financial assets relative to real economic activity, the proliferation of complex financial products, for example, derivatives, the growth of speculative investment at the expense of investment in the real economy, and it severs the link between finance and real investment, hindering structural transformation. In terms of the channels of financialization in Africa, it occurs through the financialization of international value chains, land, and the climate. Financialization leads to the four lows. The first low is that we get low fixed investment by non-financial firms. The second low is that we have a shift towards short-term financial investment. The third low is wage suppression, and finally we have low productivity. But now let's take a look at the other implications of financialization. While we get reduced policy space, decision-making shifts from elected officials to unelected financial interests, shaping state regulation and corporate behavior. There's also a household impact. State withdrawal from social services and changing bank practices draw households deeper into the financial system. There's also a corporate impact. The rise of shareholder value maximization principles leading to downsizing and distributing rather than retaining and investing corporate strategies. And finally, there's subordinate financialization like in South Africa, which is distinct from advanced economies. So in terms of the financialization in emerging markets like South Africa, we have subordinate financialization. So there's a subordinate position. Emerging markets and their currencies occupy a weaker position in the global financial system. There's also costly risk management. Policymakers are pressured to manage risk for international capital flows, often at high cost. There's also corporate reliance on finance, leading to non-financial corporations, NFCs, becoming dependent on market-based finance and foreign currency debt. Domestic banks increasingly integrate with global capital markets, and we also have financialized households. Household assets and liabilities become increasingly financialized. Within non-financial companies, micro-level tensions arise between financialization and real investment, including sectoral heterogeneity. Different sectors and positions in global value chains capture rents unevenly. There's also global value chain asymmetries, so power imbalances along the value chain. And then we have foreign dependence, reliance on foreign ownership and international cheap credit. There's also shareholder pressure, the need to meet shareholder expectations and avoid hostile takeovers. Now we move on to place-based policy and local economic development in the post-apartheid context. And so economic output is influenced by government expenditure, G. Governance occurs at a national, provincial, and local levels. The interaction between these levels is crucial for growth. Now let's take a look at place-based policy. So development strategies are often place-based, targeting specific areas with tailored policies like infrastructure investment, enterprise zones, and grants. These policies are implemented through resource equalization, grants, and specific agencies. Now let's talk a bit about decentralization. So South Africa's post-apartheid development strategy is built on decentralization, which has three pillars. First is political, the transfer of power to elected subnational authorities. Then we have administrative, the assignment of functions to subnational spheres. And then we have fiscal, devolving expenditure and revenue-raising powers. A key challenge is the uneven distribution of the tax base across the country. So in terms of fiscal transfers, South Africa's system involves revenue sharing and grants from national to subnational governments, so provinces and municipalities. And in the 2024-05 budget, local government receives the smallest share. The official reason is that municipalities can raise their own revenue by billing for services like water, electricity, etc. But some municipalities struggle with weak revenue collection and rely heavily on transfers from the national equitable share to fund their operational expenses. But we should know provinces in South Africa have specific powers divided into two categories. First is exclusive competence. These are areas where only the provincial government can make policy. For example, abattoirs, sports, roads, traffic, vehicle license plates, etc. Then we have concurrent competence. These are areas shared with the national government. For example, housing, health, education, public transport, etc. But then how is the equitable share determined? Well, the equitable share is the formula used to distribute national funds to municipalities. The allocation is designed to support municipalities with low fiscal capacity, so a weak local tax base. These municipalities should receive a more generous share to ensure fair service delivery across the country. But then what do we mean by fiscal effort? Well, the system is designed to not reward municipalities that fail to collect revenue corresponding to their capacity. Conversely, it shouldn't penalize municipalities that demonstrate good fiscal effort. And so the formula is LGES, the local government equitable share, is equal to BS plus I plus D minus RRC plus or minus C. Bisadersi. BS being the basic or essential services, I being the institutional or core admin costs, D being the development costs, so community services and development projects, the RRC being the revenue-raising capacity correction, and this is a deduction applied based on a municipality's ability to raise its own revenue. This ensures that municipalities with a stronger tax base receive less from the national pot. Now let's talk a bit about the township economy. So townships are home to a large portion of South Africa's urban population, but function as subordinate economies to affluent areas, and they are characterized by systematic underinvestment leading to limited capital accumulation and circulation, and traditional informal sectors dominated by small-scale, low-quality retail with limited technology, skills, and unproductive value addition. This contrasts to a modernizing informal sector, MIS, which uses more capital and skills to produce value-added goods and has stronger links to the formal economy. And so economic activity is concentrated along high streets, which act as the economic spine of townships. Here we have micro-enterprise hubs. These busy roads are dynamic centers for small businesses, for example hairdressers, food vendors, etc. There's also constrained operation. Most businesses operate on public sidewalks due to hard curbs and narrow roads. There's also a limited trading day. The trading day is short, early morning to late afternoon, due to safety issues and a lack of infrastructure. Now let's take a look at the major challenges in the township economy. Well, we have hard spatial constraints. Narrow road reserves and hard curbs physically limit the expansion of street trading. There's also municipal bylaws. Street trading is often deemed illegal, and when support is provided, it's in peripheral locations away from customer foot traffic. There's also an insecure tenure. Unclear land and business rights discourage long-term, durable investment and limit access to municipal services, which restricts the expansion of the local tax base. But then, what are some policy interventions and solutions? Well, we could have public investment. Invest in street lights, cameras, and other public goods to extend the trading day and improve safety. We could also have strategic infrastructure placement. We can position community infrastructure like schools and clinics to create demand for local entrepreneurs. We could also have land use reform, implementing flexible zoning, widening road reserves, and enabling the conversion of residential properties into mixed-use spaces for enterprises, and achieve formalization, so enable home-based businesses to get regulatory compliance. Now we move on to land, agrarian transformation, and rural development in Southern Africa. So land reform is presented not as a symbolic act, but as a potential tool for fundamental economic and social transformation. It consists of three elements. First is restitution, returning land to those dispossessed during apartheid. Then tenure reform, securing land rights for farm workers and labor tenants. And then redistribution, changing racially skewed land ownership patterns. Ruth Hall says that post-apartheid land policy is focused on deracializing ownership without restructuring the fundamental system of large-scale commercial farming. True agrarian transformation should involve increasing the productivity of small producers to benefit the broader economy. Now let's take a look at the critique of African land reform. While post-colonial land reforms often resulted in land being transferred to privileged elites rather than being widely redistributed, it prioritized private title and individual ownership over collective or alternative regimes, and it failed to create a productive class of capitalist farmers because the acquired land was often used for consumption and speculation rather than productive investment. And so let's take a look at the precarious situation of farm dwellers. While there's precarity, job loss, casualization of labor, and dependence on social grants, there's also mobility, being forced to move due to evictions, lack of services, or migration. And there's also the politics of holding on. A deep cultural and spiritual connection to the land, for example through ancestral graves, creates conflict with modern property relations. Now let's take a look at the use of land for social reproduction versus commercial production. In terms of social reproduction, for former labor tenants, land is an indispensable stage for survival. It's used for subsistence farming, cultural practices, and social cohesion, often relying on unpaid, gendered labor. This creates relative surplus populations who aren't integrated into the formal economy, for example, Mhlopeni KZN. Then we have commercial export. Other models integrate restituted land into global value chains. This requires significant capital, faces monopsony power from large firms, and creates dependency on loans and contracts, for example, Benton and Tarfield. And so in terms of these struggles of labor tenants or land recipients, they face repeated evictions and a lack of capital accumulation. Land allocation is based on very jaded needs, social, cultural, gendered, rather than formal civic processes, leading to complex placemaking. But now let's take a look at the challenges of commercial restitution. Even when communities succeed in commercial farming, they face big hurdles. There could be capital constraints, the need for machinery, land clearing, and infrastructure. There's also market power, limited bargaining power due to monopsony, so a single buyer, and contract farming. And finally, financial pressures. Long-time lags in revenue make access to credit crucial. Now let's challenge some of the myths about tenure and investment. The first myth is that collectively held land can't attract investment, but examples like the land bank in Mesopotamia and Egypt show it can work. The second myth is that individual private title is necessary for agricultural improvement. Mafeja argues there's no general proof that investment is higher on privately owned land than on customary tenure in Africa. The problem for farmers is not a lack of savings, but economic insecurity, making them unbankable despite having land rights that could serve as collateral. Now let's take a look at Zimbabwe's land reform, looking at it not as a simple failure but a complicated and socially progressive process with mixed outcomes. So in terms of the progressive outcomes of Zimbabwe's land reform, it successfully reversed racial land ownership patterns. It broadened access to land, enlarging the peasantry, and created a class of mid-sized farms. It also shifted production priorities from export crops to food staples, enhancing local food security. But now let's take a look at the persistent and new challenges in Zimbabwe's land reform. While it created new inequities based on uneven land access and reinforced patriarchal and low-wage labor relations, new small and mid-sized producers face major constraints, lack of inputs, exploitative markets, and low productivity. The agrarian structure remains dominated by powerful commercial interests, including South African capital. But then, what are some lessons South Africa can learn from Zimbabwe's land reform? Well, we could secure the land rights of smallholders and farm dwellers. We could develop cooperative and parallel markets to break the dominance of large food processors. South Africa could redirect financial rents to support local food production and markets. And finally, we could design land reform programs that are climate resilient, acknowledge class conflicts, and create innovative tenure forms that boost productivity and diversification. Now we move on to innovation, growth, and development. So in terms of Schumpeter's ideas on innovation, Schumpeter challenged static equilibrium models, arguing that the true engine of capitalism is dynamic innovation, which drives economic growth and business cycles. Now let's take a look at innovation as creative destruction. So innovation is an industrial mutation that revolutionizes the economic structure from within by setting up a new production function. This process creates gales of creative destruction, where new products, technologies, and organizations destroy old ones, propelling the economy forward. True competition comes from new commodities, new technologies, and new sources of supply, new markets, and new forms of organization, not minor price adjustments. And the driving force is the entrepreneur, distinct from a manager who introduces innovations. Now let's go through the three key theses on innovation. Well, the first is that major innovations require significant time and capital investment in new plant and equipment. The second is that the rise and decay of firms is central to capitalism. Every innovation is embodied in a new firm. And the third is that innovation is led by new people. New production functions don't usually come from old businesses. Now let's take a look at Edith Penrose's ideas on diversification and research. Penrose built upon Schumpeter's ideas by analyzing how firms grow and diversify based on their internal resources. Then what is the technological base? Well, a firm's capabilities are rooted in its areas of specialization, which is a bundle of machines, skills, processes, and materials. Now we take a look at the types of diversification. Well, firms diversify by moving away from their existing base in three ways. First is new markets, new products, and the same technology. Second is the same market, new products, and different technology or new technology. Third is new markets, new products, and different technology. And so we also have industrial research. This is a firm's logical response to the threat of creative destruction. It involves deliberately finding new uses for its existing technological base to innovate and survive. We also have to look at selling effort. For simple, easily imitated products, for example food or textiles, advertising and marketing are crucial. There can also be vertical integration. Firms may integrate backward, producing their own inputs, or forward, controlling distribution or retailing. And they do this for technical efficiency, stable supplies, and profitable markets. But then what is the role of the state in innovation? Well, the state's role isn't limited to fixing market failures, as per neoclassical views. Some argue that the state should be an investor of first resort, actively shaping and creating markets by taking on high-risk investment that the private sector avoids, for example Mazzucato. And so the state should pursue mission-oriented policies to tackle grand challenges, for example climate change, pandemics, etc. And this involves the following: supporting R&D and learning, developing and diffusing general-purpose technologies, expanding key innovative sectors, promoting infrastructural development, and using dynamic, continuous evaluation rather than just post-project analysis. Now let's take a look at China's entrepreneurial state. China exemplifies the successful implementation of a strategic, mission-oriented industrial policy. So in terms of renewable energy, China's dominance in solar and wind is a direct result of the state designating them as strategic emerging industries. State support enabled Chinese firms to master, improve, and scale production, leading to control of the entire supply chain. And then in terms of electric vehicles, EVs, China's success as the world's largest EV producer and exporter stems from a coherent policy mix. They have demand management, so fiscal subsidies for buyers, building complementaries, incentives to build charging station networks, and institutional coherence, coordinating national and subnational agencies to manage interests. They also had regulatory targets, setting standards and mandating NEV production shares for automakers. Now let's take a look at South Africa's just energy transition. South Africa provides an example of a state attempting to act entrepreneurially in a complex socio-economic context. So in terms of the energy transition plan, the state is actively phasing out coal power and rapidly integrating renewables into the energy mix by 2030. And in terms of the public sector role, the state is directly financing renewable development, creating markets, and de-risking private investment through tools like procurement, subsidies, and guarantees. Eskom, the state utility, is obligated to purchase power from independent power producers, IPPs, which is a policy that guarantees a market and de-risks investments.